Now we're going to move on to a new set of lectures on federalism. In my experience, students don't seem to be particularly excited about the prospect of talking about federalism. Probably some political scientists aren't excited about the prospect as well. But I have to tell you that federalism actually winds up being a really significant concept in our lives. One of the things I believe that you're going to find out by the end of this lecture is federalism winds up being significant in some of the things that you experience in your lives and I experience in my life. This negotiation between the power of the national government and the state government and who's in charge. And so I'm going to talk about that more fully. So while it may not seem like federalism is particularly important or interesting right now, hopefully by the end of this set of lectures, you'll see that it is significant and it is actually interesting, period. We'll see. So in terms of our learning objectives, at the end of this lecture, you'll be able to understand the meaning and purpose of separation of powers and checks and balances. Those two different concepts. You'll be able to distinguish between the enumerated powers, implied powers, reserved powers, and concurrent shared powers and prohibited powers at both the national and the state level. And you'll be able to provide an example of each of the powers that I just mentioned. You'll be able to identify some of the limitations that the Constitution places on national government, but also some of the limitations that it places on state governments. And you'll be able to explain the meaning and the significance of the supremacy clause as it relates to federalism. By the way, this is one of those areas where it's so important that you watch the lecture videos. Let me explain why. If you go to your book, your textbook, or you go online, the definition and explanation that you'll find of federalism is different than the one that I provide. I think mine is right and more accurate than the textbook and other online definitions of federalism. That's why I'm teaching this class, because I think it's important to explain these things clearly. But if a student goes to an online source or relies on their textbook to answer an essay question about the supremacy clause, it's going to be obvious right away. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that there'll be words missing that'll be obvious right away that they did not rely on the lecture videos. So please, please, watch the videos. Again, I know I'm a slow talker. Many professors are. So if you need to speed up the video so that it goes a little fast and you don't have to deal with all my ponderous pauses, go ahead and do that. But you have to watch the lecture videos to do well in this class. Back to the learning objectives. You'll also be able to explain the meaning of the full faith and credit clause, and you'll see the significance that it's played in our lives recently. You'll explain how ongoing disputes over federalism are relevant to current political events, and they are. They really are, which is why I think that federalism winds up being a more interesting topic than students realize at the beginning. And lastly, you'll be able to explain the difference between categorical grants and block grants. When I talk about federalism, the definition, as you can see on the video, is the constitutional division of governing authority between the national and state governments. Now, that's like I do in all of my lectures, there's a definition. Let me elaborate on that. When I talk about the constitutional division of governing authority, what I'm talking about first is that the authority given to the national government or federal government and the authority given to the state is spelled out in the Constitution. So the constitutional division of governing authority is because it comes from the Constitution. When I talk about governing authority, I'm talking about the ability to make decisions over certain policies, because as you'll see, there are some things that are the responsibility of the federal government, and there are some things that are the responsibility of the state government. Oftentimes when people talk about federalism and this constitutional division of governing authority, they make it seem like in the Constitution it's clearly laid out what the federal government can do and what the state governments could do. But it's not. It's constantly being negotiated. The federal government and the state government are constantly sort of battling one another over who's in control of certain policies. We'll talk about that more as we go through these lecture videos. Two concepts that are important in understanding federalism are the separation of powers and checks and balances. In the next video, I'm going to do a visual presentation of this concept, and we'll go into this in more detail. But as an introduction to those ideas, let me talk about each one individually. When I talk about separation of powers, the idea is that when the framers set up the Constitution, they dispersed decision-making authority. They wanted to make sure that the authority to make decisions was spread out to as many people, as many branches of government as possible. If you recall from the first election, we came from a unitary system where the king had all the power. The king could write the laws, the king could enforce the laws, the king could interpret the laws. What the framers said was this is exactly what leads to tyranny. Giving in one person all that power is problematic. And so what did they do? They said, we're going to create a legislative branch that's going to have the authority to write laws. And we're going to split it in half, and we're going to have a House of Representatives and a Senate. So we divide up that authority. Then we're going to have an executive branch. They're going to be the ones who enforce the laws. Then we're going to have a judicial branch. They're going to be the ones that interpret the laws. Rather than giving all this power to one person, they're going to spread it out so that decision-making authority has to be agreed upon among a larger group of people. So that's what I mean by the separation of powers. When it comes to checks and balances, what the framers knew was there's a tendency for, there would likely be a tendency for each of these groups to want to take power, take more power than the Constitution gave them. So one of the things that they did, and this is where we use the phrase checks and balances. Checks really is another word for restrain, but they provided each branch with the ability to protect its own prerogatives. In other words, each branch was given its own authority to make policy decisions. And so they gave the branches the ability to protect itself. And then they also provided each branch with the ability to check or restrain other branches. If another branch started to get out of control, they gave it the ability to restrain them as well. This is the idea, these two different ideas of dividing up division-making authority, and then giving each branch the ability to protect itself from encroachments, from efforts on the part of other branches to take its power. That was the idea of dividing up authority. And the goal was to spread decision-making authority so widely that it was difficult for any one group to take too much power. Because the framers, having come from a unitary system, were of the belief that if you gave any one group too much power, it would eventually turn into tyranny. It wouldn't be a democracy. And so the goal of federalism is to prevent any one group from gaining too much governing authority as to be able to make all of the decisions. That was the plan. Essentially to create what I sometimes refer to as a free-for-all. Free-for-all in the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges that if it worked properly, no one would ever win. Now, one final thing. And we'll be talking about this as the semester goes on. While the framers gave each of the branches, and in this case I'm specifically talking about the legislative branch, the ability to protect itself from encroachments on the part of the executive branch, which was what they were really worried about. What they didn't do is they didn't put into the Constitution anything to prevent the legislative branch from giving power to the executive branch. They were worried about the executive branch trying to take power. They didn't anticipate that the legislative branch was just going to continue to give more and more and more power to the executive branch. That's why our system, which was initially designed with the legislative branch being the center of the political universe, has shifted, and now the executive branch, the president, is the center of our political universe. But Congress has played a huge role in that. But we'll be discussing all that further. But again, the goal was to spread out decision-making authority and give each branch of government the ability to protect its own prerogatives and to restrain other branches so that no one group gained so much power that it became tyrannical. So the next video, I'm going to explain the same sort of thing in a more visual form.